This is IBM Museum. In this video, I'm going to go over a little bit of the explanation of the PS2s coming in two series. The 8500 series was earlier. The 9500 series with some of the later features that IBM introduced for PS2s came along later on. There are particular models that are in both series, and this is the going to be a video about the Model 56 and Model 57. That can come in four versions. That was the all the way from the 8556, 8557 up to the 9556 and 9557. So I'll be going over the system planars that can be in these units, a little bit of how to recognize planar features, what they have to them, as well as an exterior view. So seeing a PS2, and of course with the that it matches inside to what it's badged as, a quick way to evaluate what level of PS2 that is, which series it belongs to, and the locations of the label, so you can read that model and submodel encoding as well to recognize that PS2 for what it is. So let's get started by looking at the insides. This is the system planar for the IBM PS2 Model 56SX and Model 57SX. The 4-digit model encoding is an 8556 or 8557 respectively. It has an Intel 386SX 20 megahertz CPU. So the 3-digit submodel encoding has a 4 as the middle digit. A summary table of all Model 56 and 57 model and submodel encodings will be presented later in the video. This planar has an ID of E6FE for the 8556 unit and E2FE for the 8557 unit. The planar ID is changed by which riser is installed of either 3 or 5 microchannel adapter slots. The relevant risers will be covered in a later section of this video. All Model 56 systems are in a space-saver, smaller desktop case, considered to be a 3x3, 3 16-bit microchannel adapter slots, and 3 drive bays. The 8556 models actually only have 2 drive positions, typically filled with the primary diskette drive and a SCSI hard drive, with no room for an internal SCSI CD-ROM drive. The 9556 units add an internal hard drive carrier between the riser and power supply unit, abbreviated as PSU, to leave space for an internal CD-ROM or other possible drive requiring access from the front panel. The PS2 Model 57 systems are in a larger 5x5 desktop case. 5 16-bit microchannel slots and 5 drive bays. All 16-bit IBM Ultima models are in the Model 57 case. At a later point in the video, I will show the case sizes and a few possible case badges, as well as the location of the model and submodel encoding label, also containing the serial number. Here is the Intel 386SX 20 megahertz CPU. The CPU level can be upgraded in all but the highest level Model 56 or 57 systems. In this location is a socket for the 386SX numeric coprocessor over the top of a blue socket with more pins. I will cover the CPU daughter cards that can be put in this socket in a later portion of the video. On an 8556 or 8557 planar or CPU daughter card, a 20 MHz or higher 386xSX or 387SL FPU is used. This is the system BIOS, and the EEPROM can be socketed like this one is, or soldered in place. The three 72-pin SIM sockets are here: MEM1, MEM2, and MEM3. Although up to 8 MB SIMs can be placed in the sockets, the system has 24 memory address lines for a maximum of 16 MB of RAM. Use of a microchannel memory expansion adapter to add memory to the 16 MB of memory space is not supported. The power supply and switch connections are here. The respective PSUs are shared with other PS2 systems that use the same style of case as the Model 56 and 57. This is an audio connection for a front panel speaker connection or multimedia audio controls and the interface to a sound card on the system. This is the diskette drive connection. These models support the 2.8 MB diskette drive and the internal EE or electronic eject 5¼ inch 1.2 MB diskette drives. Here is the SCSI small computer systems interface, 50-pin internal connection, and a microcontroller and microcode EEPROM, which can be soldered or socketed in place. The SCSI level utility detects the version of this microcode. Hard drives up to 1 GB and CD-ROMs are the more common devices connected internally on these models. Up to 7 devices are supported. The SCSI controller is of the same design for the Tribble or SCSI A adapters with an 8032 microcontroller. On the back of the planar is a non-standard 60-pin external SCSI connection. It is terminated by a resistor pack if unused. At the other end are the PS2 mouse and keyboard connections. A host connect 122 key keyboard is supported in addition to the standard Model M 101 key keyboard. There is a 25-pin parallel port that supports the connection of a post-error display, as all PS2 models do. That functionality has been covered in a prior video on my channel. A single 25-pin serial port is on the 8556 and 8557 system planars, using the same circuitry to make it compatible with a 16550 UART with a 16-byte 50. Lastly, there is a high-density 15-pin SVGA connection. The SVGA controller on the 8556 and 8557 planar is a collaboration between IBM and Texas Instruments. 256 kilobyte of VRAM comes standard and can be upgraded to 512 KB with the addition of 2 zip chips in sockets, as this unit has, to be able to use a Windows 3.1 and VESA TSR driver for 256 color depth. A later video will cover this VRAM upgrade and driver installation. This is a Model 56 SLC and Model 57 SLC system planar. The system model is still an 8556 or 8557 respectively. The 3-digit submodel encoding has a 5 to signify the IBM 386 SLC 20 MHz CPU. The planar ID is still E6FE for the Model 56 systems and E2FE for the Model 57s. Indeed, the only item that has changed from the 386SX planar is the IBM 386 SLC underneath the flat gold-colored heatsink. The 386 SLC has 8 kilobyte of L1 CPU cache and is able to run all Intel 486SX instructions. I do not know why such a large heatsink was used, as the 386 SLC 20 MHz doesn't generate that much heat. This planar has the daughter card socket exposed, with the socket for the 387SX removed. The same BIOS version as on my 386SX planar is also on the 386 SLC planar, although the IBM SLC is slightly more optimized to work with a Cyrix 387SX numeric coprocessor. All other characteristics and limitations of the 386 SLC planar are identical to the SX planar. The 2 chips for the VRAM expansion are also not present, making this unit capable of only up to 16 colors at 640 by 480 resolution. This is a 9556 and 9557 system planar, having expanded features and CPU capabilities over the 8556 and 8557 models. It has a planar ID of E1FE in a Model 56 system and E0FE in a Model 57 system. The CPU is an IBM 46 SLC2 50 MHz, clock doubled internally from the 25 MHz planar frequency. The 46 SLC2 has 16 kilobyte L1 CPU cache and is able to run all Intel 486SX instructions. For a 50 MHz 46 SLC2, the 9556 and 9557 would have the middle digit of the 3-digit submodel encoding as a capital B, as in boy. This unit also has the 387SX interposer socket removed. But if a 387SX is used on the planar or a CPU daughter card, it must be rated at 25 MHz or above. There is the addition of a security interlock connection at the front of the planar. The front panel audio connection and the diskette drive connection are slightly larger, but the diskette drive types are still the same as the 8556 and 8557 models. The SCSI bus is fused and auto-terminated. 2 serial ports replace the single serial port of the 8556 and 8557. The video is now IBM's XGA2 with 1 megabyte of VRAM for increased resolutions, color depth, and performance. This is a 9556 and 9557 system planar with a 46 SLC3 75 megahertz CPU, which is in a slightly bigger PLCC chip package than the 46 SLC2. Unlike the 46 SLC2 CPU, the 46 SLC3 has a heatsink. The 46 SLC3 has the same 16 kilobyte L1 CPU cache as the 46 SLC2, and is also able to run all Intel 486SX instructions. For a 75 megahertz 46 SLC3, the 9556 and 9557 would have the middle digit of the 3-digit submodel encoding as a capital E as in Edward. Despite the change to a clock-tripled 486 SLC3 CPU, the planar ID of E1FE is still used for a Model 56 system and E0FE for a Model 57 system, the same as the 486 SLC2 50 megahertz planar has. This planar has the 387SX interposer socket in place. It would not be removed because there is no CPU daughter card faster than the 486 SLC3 75 megahertz CPU on the system planar. If a 387SX is used in the interposer socket, it must be rated at 25 megahertz or above. The heatsink is missing from the XGA2 RAM deck on this planar. I can see the outline, but in some 9556 and 9557 planars, it is not present. In later tests, I can check the temperature of the RAM deck with my infrared thermometer. With all the other features of the 46 SLC2 50 megahertz planar, IBM retooling a planar with the 46 SLC3 CPU doesn't make much sense to me. A 46 SLC3 75 megahertz CPU daughter card upgrade, featured next, could have been put in place for the same functionality. And I'm going to present the CPU daughter cards in the reverse order just because it's easier to show the planars that they upgrade in that method. And of course, there is no CPU daughter card that is functional for the planar with the 486 SLC3 75 megahertz CPU. And normally the interposer for the 387SX socket is left in place for putting a compatible numeric coprocessor in that position. Now on the 9500 series planar with the 46 SLC2 CPU, there is a CPU daughter card that has a 486 SLC3 CPU. So that is, you go through to install that, you're removing the 387 if you have one in the socket and that interposer. IBM included a centering block, and that kind of protects the bottom half of those, that pin assembly as it goes in. It helps you center the assembly in there. They also included the support, but I don't see where the planar with the 46 SLC2, these holes don't line up for that support bracket. So I don't know what assembly goes back there to support the daughter card when it's on this planar in this instance, but in any regard, it's put in like that. And then you have where the heatsink, if it's on the XGA2 RAM DAC, that's effectively, it's not interfering with that. That kind of fits in that notch there. Then your 387SX numeric coprocessor, if you have one, rated at that 25 megahertz would be put back into the socket that's actually on the daughter card. And in this case, the CPU daughter card with the 46 SLC3 CPU effectively takes that to the same level as the planar with the 46 SLC3 CPU there. And that's the condition that I speculated of why IBM went through and redesigned basically this planar, or put the 46 SLC3 CPU on this planar in the bigger package. They had to retool the whole planar when they could have just simply gone through and put this daughter card onto the 46 SLC2 planar for the same functionality. And when it's in place like this on the on this planar, since it operates at that clock tripled rate internally of 75 megahertz, this is also classified as a having an E for that middle digit or middle character of that sub-model encoding, showing that it has that level of CPU. And the CPU daughter card with the 486 SLC3 can also be used to upgrade the 8500 series planars having the 386 SLC or the 386SX CPU. The same thing, the centering block goes over that socket. The support bracket does actually function as intended. There's slots for that to be put in place. And when it's on this planar, it's over the top of the VRAM that chips that are soldered in here, but it doesn't conflict with the position of the sockets for the VRAM expansion here. And then if you had a 20 megahertz 387SX numeric coprocessor that you'd removed with that interposer socket, it would also be placed in there, installed on the daughter card in that instance. And when the 486 SLC3 CPU is on an 8500 series planar to upgrade it, that clock tripled frequency is only 60 megahertz in this instance. So it runs a little bit slower on the 8500 series systems. And IBM did not have a submodel encoding for the 60 megahertz CPU frequency when it was put in place on these planars. And it's not the submodel encoding of E as in Edward, like it is in the other instances, because IBM also had that submodel encoding mean the frequency that the CPU was actually run at. And I do believe in that instance where it's actually IBM had intended the submodel encoding to be 7 for that middle character of the 3-digit submodel encoding. And here is the planar with the 386SX 20 megahertz, where the CPU daughter card with the 486 SLC3 can be installed. It's also run internally at that 60 megahertz. And this planar has those VRAM expansion chips installed in the socket just to show that those sit a little bit higher and are not interfered with by having that daughter card in place. And the CPU daughter card with the 486 SLC2 does not have the heatsink on the daughter card, just like it's on the CPU for the planar, and is roughly the same shape as the outline of the 46 SLC3 CPU daughter card, and goes in effectively the same position. Since it is a clock doubled CPU, it runs internally at twice the frequency of the planar. In this case, for the 8500 series planars that it upgrades, it runs at 40 megahertz internally. And IBM had the CPU encoding of the digit of 6 being in that center position of the submodel to denote the speed of the CPU in that instance. And just like the SLC3 daughter card, it still leaves those VRAM chips or sockets that would be used for expansion exposed along that edge of the CPU daughter card. And it can also be used on the 386 SX planar the same way, going into that position. Let me go through, and the support bracket would be there to have that in place on that planar. Same limitations where that CPU is run internally at 40 megahertz when it's on the 386 SX planar as well. And lastly, the cached CPU daughter card, and that's with the IBM 386 SLC CPU with that same heatsink over the top of it as it has on the planar, would be used to upgrade only the planar with the 386 SX CPU. And in that case, IBM, this bracket doesn't work for the wider CPU daughter card, but IBM included 2 pins that are basically, they're longer on one side. You put the shorter end into the planar side, and that's a very tight fit. It doesn't help with me having the foam on the underside that is kind of absorbing a lot of the push. But then that goes in place and has the holes for those pins to go in that position. And let me move these pins out of the way temporarily. I just want to check the clearance. It still goes pretty tight to where those VRAM expansion modules are, and looks like it may not even be able to be fully seated if those VRAM modules are in place. So that might be a limitation, that really, that if you have that CPU daughter card, well, that seems like it seats all the way. And this effectively would run the CPU at that 20 megahertz. It's not any sort of clock multiplying CPU. It's running at the same frequency as that 386SX was. So this is basically functionally equivalent to the separate planar with the 386 SLC CPU on it. In this case, it has that same CPU submodel encoding of 5 being that middle digit of the 3-digit submodel encoding. And there is an unpopulated jumper position here that says bypass jumper. And I think that would be if you have a Cyrix FPU present in this socket of some functionality that IBM intended for that, because the 386 SLC CPU that they designed is more optimized to work with a Cyrix numeric coprocessor than other brands like Intel. And that's just speculation on my part. I'll probably go through and test with a multimeter just to see what pins that goes to and get that a little bit more identified as I go through and I produce the high resolution photos of all these planars, all these CPU daughter cards. Onto the risers. This is the 3-slot riser that would be in a Model 56. And these risers are actually shared between the 8500 series Model 56 and the 9500 series Model 56. And this is a protector over the top of that coin cell battery. There is batteries on the risers for the Model 56 and 57, that generic CR 2032 coin cell battery that's put in there, and somehow this goes through or protects for some reason the top of that battery being in that socket. And this is slot 1. Slot 2 is an AVE slot, that auxiliary video extension. And then slot 3. And slot 1 and 3 are just that normal 16-bit microchannel slots. And here is the 5-slot riser for the Model 57. And again, the riser is shared between the 8500 series Model 57 and the 9500 series Model 57. The battery position is here. It doesn't have any protector over the top of it in this instance for the Model 57. And the slot 1 is the same as on the Model 56, but it does look like on the circuit board that IBM designed that a base video extension socket could be soldered there instead of just the basic 16-bit microchannel slot in some instance of one of the planars of the Model 57 not having that base video, or some other model basically that was able to use the same riser. The slot 2 is with that AVE extension, the auxiliary video extension. It's a little bit shorter than the base video extension, little bit different purpose. The slot 3, 4, and 5 are that conventional 16-bit microchannel slots again. There is a header here, and it does have some solder pads that go back to other chips that were on the back side of the riser, and IBM may have intended that for some other functionality as well. Now, the IBM systems that have a riser, they do get that planar ID functionality from whatever riser is installed on the planar. That's how the planar ID shifts the numbers between like the model 56 and 57. And so there is typically some loopback pins here on the planar connector that just tell the system of which riser is in place, so it knows how to respond with whatever planar ID that's appropriate, and knows how many microchannel slots it basically has on that riser attached to the system planar. In a little bit of an inside-out order, we have the cases for the Model 56 here on top and Model 57. Here is a 6-inch ruler. For those of you not familiar with the dimensions of my hand, that makes the Model 56 case about 14 inches wide and 4.5 inches tall. The Model 57 case is about 17 inches wide and 6.5 inches tall. These are both the same depth. They have a depth of about 15 inches for the case, but of course you need to leave room on the back for those connections coming in, and so this is just not the back up against the wall. This case would sit out at least probably a few inches from on like a computer desk that has a back panel or something like that. Now, you are noticing the badges here. They have a little bit of meaning to the system as well. The darker gray with the silver lettering means an 8500 series. So that would make this an 8556 if the badge is indeed matched up to what is inside the system. And then the lighter gray with the blue lettering on the IBM logo is a 9500 series. And these badges can be used interchangeably depending on what planar is inside these systems. And the CPU daughter card does not change the series of the PS2. It's still, even a 46 SLC3 CPU daughter card that's on an 8500 series Model 56, something like that. But then you also have the model and submodel encoding as well as the serial number label on the Model 56 here. So this would normally read that 8556 dash and then have the 3-digit submodel, and that middle digit of the submodel again is where the CPU value is. So for the 8500 series, being that it is a 4 for the 386 SX 20 megahertz, a 5 for the 386 SLC 20 megahertz, a 6 if you happen to have the 46 SLC2 daughter card in there on this planar. It's undefined for the 46 SLC3 CPU to in that IBM sequence. I do believe that's a 7, but I haven't seen that documented otherwise when that 46 SLC3 CPU daughter card is on the 8500 series. For the 9500 series, it is the middle digit is either that B for a 46 SLC2 or E as in Edward for the 46 SLC3 CPU. So another badge coloring that you can encounter is the Ultima Models. And the Ultima is always put in the larger case. So be it if it's a Model 57 or Model 77, the 46 level of this style of case, it'll be a black badge background, and the IBM in it will be a rainbow colored or multicolored sequence. The model, submodel, and serial number label is still in that same position for the Model 57, 77 style cases. And of course, you will see the audio control connections and panel here. The connections for a headphone. I think this is for a microphone, and the volume control. There is a speaker that's behind this assembly that's a little bit bigger for these units. So if you don't have headphones plugged in or the connections to the audio card, you will hear the system sounds from that speaker as well. And of course, with the bigger style case, more drive bays accessible, with the Ultima models, you should see the addition of the CD-ROM, and internally there should be a sound card as well for to make it an Ultima model as well. So that's a little bit of recognition of what you see on the outside of the case compared to the system planar and daughter cards, CPU daughter cards that I went over earlier. If you happen to like this video, please click on that like button. Please subscribe to my channel. But that's all I have for now. This is IBM Museum. Thank you. So this is an outtake of the summary information that I should have presented within the video. And of course, you can go through and pause to read the information that I've listed down here. Thank you. And here is the second outtake about the cap that I'm wearing. It says Top Fab, IBM Burlington. And even though I don't have any association with the plant or never worked for IBM, that is from the Burlington, Vermont plant where the 386 SLC CPU, the 46 SLC2 CPU, 46 SLC3 CPU likely were fabricated at that plant, as well as other chips and other later CPUs. I don't know the true history, but I just thought I would add that in to the video. Thank you.